Today is Tuesday, March 18th, 2014. My name is Nancy Ungerman, and I'll be interviewing Susan Lichten, and the video photographer is Ruth Andrus. We're doing this for the Dallas Jewish Historical Society, and we're at the Jewish Community Center of Dallas. Hello, Sue Lichten.
Hello, Nancy.
I'm so glad you're here today.
So am I.
We're going to start at the beginning. Where are you from? Are you a Dallasite?
I am not a Dallasite, but I've lived here long enough. I feel like an early Texas settler. No, I was born in Boston, Massachusetts.
Your parents, did they come from?
Both my parents were born in this country.
Wow, you go back.
My mother in Cleveland and my father in Boston.
Your grandparents?
I am not positive. My maternal grandfather, I believe, was born in England. I do not know for sure about my paternal grandparents. I'm sorry.
No, it's interesting. What did your parents do for a living?
Well, my father went to Harvard and Harvard Law School, but then came World War I. So he was in the Army, and he was a second lieutenant and in France. And while the war was going on, his father, who had a chain of stores throughout New England, a chain, maybe 5 or 6, of women's clothing stores called S. Rogers and Sons. My father's father passed away during the war. So when the war was over and he came back, he felt, being the oldest in that family of 8, that he needed to take over. So he didn't practice law then. And he and his brothers ran these stores, about 6 of them.
Throughout Boston,
there was one in Boston, one in Nashua, New Hampshire, one in Portland, Maine, Providence, Rhode Island. In New England, there were about 5 or 6 stores.
Yeah, very interesting. Well, what got you here?
Pardon?
What got you here to Dallas?
What brought me to Dallas? My husband's work.
So you met him in Boston?
We were both in college there.
Mm-hmm.
He was at MIT and I was at Radcliffe.
I see. And your children carried on that tradition too, didn't, I think, of going to Harvard.
Well, one went to Harvard, and one worked at Harvard for a long time.
You're actually a Depression child.
I am, and that kind of changed my father's work.
I'll bet.
Because that hit hard, and they had to close some of the stores. And so my father did practice law briefly with a firm after he left the retail business.
That's interesting. Growing up, were you connected, or your parents connected to any Jewish activities or participate in?
My father came from a very pious family, and we were at my grandmother's every Friday night for Shabbat dinner, which was wonderful.
Yeah.
And he always conducted the service.
Yeah.
Not so much with my mother's family.
So you were his 8 brothers involved too on the Friday night dinners?
Yes, it was a big game.
As a child growing up in Boston, did you experience any anti-Semitism?
I wasn't aware of a thing.
Mm-hmm.
Most of my school friends weren't Jewish. I went to Sunday school at Temple Israel, but not for long because of the Depression. I think my parents were rather proud, and they felt they couldn't pay the dues to belong to Temple Israel anymore. So I only went to Sunday school through the 3rd grade.
You met your husband in college and married after college or during college?
Not quite.
Uh-huh.
He was 2 years ahead of me.
Uh-huh.
And so when he graduated that summer, that June, we were married, and that was the end of my sophomore year. But I finished college. I transferred because his job was in Philadelphia, which actually was where he was from. So I transferred to Bryn Mawr. And at that time, it was rather unusual to be married and going to college. But I finished. I graduated from Bryn Mawr.
In Philadelphia. And from there, you came to Dallas?
No.
Are we talking about that?
No. Well, Bob, my husband, you probably know, was an aeronautical engineer in rotary wing, which means helicopters. And while he was still a student at MIT, he was working on the design for what is now called the V-22 Osprey. And he met a fellow who also sort of had the same idea, but he wasn't really an trained engineer. But he had come out of, he was a single guy who had come out of the war, but before he went into the war, he put his money into some investment which ballooned. So he had money, and with his money and Bob's brains, they formed a company called Transcendental Aircraft Company to develop this aircraft.
And this is in Philadelphia.
They had a little sort of shop or whatever in a room behind a bar in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, because we were living there, so I could be close to campus. And they worked on that there. If I ever wanted to call Bob, I had to call the bartender, and he would go back and get him to come to the phone. Anyway, for various reasons, I think mainly engineering-wise, they came to some disagreement, so they split up. And then Bob went to Larry Bell, for whom Bell Helicopter, although at that time it was called Bell Aircraft, and it was in Buffalo, New York. And he said, I have this design, and I would like to develop it through your company. So he talked Larry Bell into taking him on to do that, which he did. But after, in 52, Bell Aircraft in Buffalo, New York became Bell Helicopter, and the whole division moved to Hurst, Texas.
So this is the 50s, 52 or 53?
In 52, we came to Dallas.
Living in Hurst, or?
No, it's interesting that you ask. This is a typical engineer solving problem. We didn't know anyone when we came here. So we looked at areas in Fort Worth, which are fairly near the plant, to live, and areas in Dallas. It really didn't matter. We didn't know anyone here. But the engineer said, well, when I go to work in the morning, if we live in Dallas, the sun will be behind me. And when I come home at night, it will be behind me. So we lived in Dallas.
That made your decision? By this time you have how many children?
Oh, well, in Philadelphia, our first son was born in Bryn Mawr Hospital. His name is Tom. When we moved to Buffalo, our second son was born. And when we came to Dallas, our third son was born.
Did you have a career of any sort besides raising 3 boys?
No, I had always wanted to go to social work school. And when we came here after Dave, our youngest, was getting into school, I went over to UTA, University of Texas at Arlington, where there's a social work school, to inquire about getting admitted, and went through some papers, and they said I would have to take the GRE. Well, I hadn't taken a test for quite a while, so I thought, for practice, I'll take the state merit exam, just for practice for taking the GRE. Well, in Texas, when they hire people, they look at the listing of test results on the state merit exam. They don't interview people, they just take them, off the top. And apparently I got a good grade on that, and I got a call. We have an opening at the Texas Employment Commission for an interviewer, and we have to know in 24 hours.
How old are the kids?
Well, Dave, our youngest, I think, was in kindergarten, and he was. So I figured a bird in the hand. So I took the job. And I loved it because I enjoy working with people. And I worked at the TEC, which was down on Ross Avenue, and these were people who it was a period of very high unemployment. So people were coming in to apply for unemployment benefits. And I interviewed them, and that was my job.
Full-time?
What?
Full-time job?
Oh, at the time,
Yeah.
but I knew it was not permanent because it depended on the amount of employment and unemployment.
I thought 50s, they were just coming out of that wasn't a prosperous time.
Apparently not,
Yeah.
in Texas anyway. There was a
Yeah.
lot of unemployment then.
Yeah. Where did your children, what high school did your kids go to, or where was their
High
education?
school, well, Tom, our oldest, went to Hillcrest, but Hillcrest was already starting its downhill trend then, and Tom apparently ended up teaching the history class there, and we kept saying, Tom, if you want to go to St. Mark's, it's fine. And he said, no, but his good friend, Jimmy Strauss, was at St. Mark's, and unbeknownst to us, that August, he went over to St. Mark's and took the admissions test, and came back and told us he passed it. He wanted to go to St. Mark's. So he left Hillcrest his sophomore year then. And then when John came along and finished junior high at Benjamin Franklin, he said, John better go to St. Mark's too. And then when Dave finished Preston Hollow, they both said, send them to St. Mark's. So they all ended up at St. Mark's. Yeah.
Which was always a very fine school.
Oh, it was.
Yeah. What Jewish activities have you been involved in?
I, of course, joined we joined Temple, so our kids were
Temple.
confirmed there, and I was involved in sisterhood, I served on the Temple board. Of course, I joined council. I can't remember if I was on the board there. And was very involved in WICS, W-I-C-S, Women in Community Service. Do you remember that? It was helping young women prepare for and get jobs.
You were involved in that, Ruth?
No. What did you do with that?
And I'm not sure if it was through sisterhood or council. Probably council. So I was involved in that. But also, I also joined the Temple Choir, which I am still in after over 50 years. At Temple also, I was on the music committee for a long time and chaired it also.
So Temple has been your mainstay for 50 years?
No, it has not. I've been involved in other things in the community, not Jewish.
And tell me about those.
I got involved in the Friends of the Dallas Public Library. Was on the board there and served as president for a term. What else? Oh, League of Women Voters. League of Women Voters for sure.
Yes.
And I was on the board there and was a unit leader. And I'm still a great admirer of the League, but not active. Also active in political campaigns, supporting candidates that I felt should be elected.
Yeah. Not always successful, right? Who are your role models? Who were your role models over the years?
Well, my biggest role model was my husband. Not only was he brilliant in the field of science and a leader, he was president of the American Helicopter Society, editor of their journal, but he was also a fierce believer in civil rights and social justice, and a fighter for the same. And
Was he involved in the movement in the 60s in Dallas?
very much so, very much so. Uh-huh.
In what way?
In what way?
In what way? Well, I'll give you an incident. There was a place in Dallas called the Piccadilly Cafeteria downtown. And he was part of an effort to try to integrate that as far as their customers went. There was a young man named Ernest McMillan, who was a black man, very active in SNCC, students, something coordinating, I forget what it stands for. But anyway, it was a group of young black people here, and so they decided they would go to Piccadilly Cafeteria to have lunch. And they stood in line, and Bob also, and our two older sons went too, for this, which ended up in a big demonstration. And I think a couple of the blacks, including Ernest McMillan, being hauled off to jail. And also Bob and our 2 sons.
We're hauled off?
Mhm.
That's great.
And our youngest was in tears that he couldn't go be involved in this.
How old was he?
Oh, I don't know, he was about probably 7 or 8 at the time. But he understood what was going on. Anyway, it certainly hit the papers, and Bob raised bail to get McMillan out.
Al Lipscomb, too. He marched and was sent to jail. Al Lipscomb, our city council.
Al Lipscomb came a little later. He wasn't involved in that Piccadilly thing, as I recall.
Yeah, yeah. He was at SMU. He did it at SMU.
Okay.
Yeah. How has Dallas changed for you in the last
Oh, well, I think that whole
50
movement-
years?
It's changed in many ways, visually, certainly, but I don't think we see the segregation that we saw then, and the discrimination. I think that has really improved. Of course, the skyline has improved, but Bob also was a pilot. And I remember we went up, he got a helicopter from Bell, and we went down the expressway in this helicopter, he and I, and landed on the roof of the Southland Life, which had a heliport. And that was very exciting.
Yeah. Do any of your children or grandchildren live in this area?
No more. No more. I have them from Scotland to Oakland.
Who lives in Scotland?
Well,
and why?
actually, Katie just moved from Edinburgh she's now in Cambridge, in the UK, in England.
Mhm. Mhm. You must have great-grandchildren.
I wish.
Okay.
Not yet.
Okay.
Only one of my grandchildren is married.
How did the Jewish community change?
Has the Jewish community changed for you in any way you can talk about?
Yeah, that's a good question. I really haven't thought about that. I think some really wonderful things have come from individuals in the Jewish community, leadership-wise,
Mhm.
and we are respected. Of course, Rabbi Olin set the tone for that.
Yes. Yes. In his own way.
Mhm. It's always fascinating to me. I have a lot of non-Jewish friends, how curious they are about Judaism, and interested too.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. What have I left out? What have I left out? How did you did you use your gardening as a professional tool at all? I know you were a gardener.
No. The first thing I did, well, I worked at Brookhaven College for 20 years as an administrator in continuing ed.
Mhm.
And the first thing I did after I retired, which I couldn't do when I was working, I wanted to become a master gardener, Texas master gardener. So I did join a master gardener class and became a master gardener, which involved a good number of volunteer hours in the community, and also to maintain your standing as a master gardener, you must continue that. I did drop that a few years ago, but I do love gardening and the outdoors.
Yeah. I know. Do you travel to, you have another home, and how often do you get there?
Not often enough, and that's another whole story, because my husband was not only a wonderful aeronautical engineer, but a frustrated architect, and he was fascinated. So he designed this house and gave his drawings to architect couple friends of ours who put it into working plans. And he was wonderful with his hands, as you know, carpenter-wise and with tools. And so with our 3 sons and a friend of one of theirs, we did most of the carpentry in building this house. Not the plumbing and the electrical and the concrete work, although we did throw around, I mean the boys did, not me, bags of concrete when that was going on too, when the slab was being laid. But
You probably saw the junior college system bloom.
well, that was one of our big efforts in the League of Women Voters, actually, to help get that started. And it is a wonderful system. Brookhaven, where I worked, is the youngest of the 7 campuses. But they all have their pluses.
Well, this has been wonderful. I wonder if I left anything out you'd want to add?
Well, don't get me started on my kids. I'm really proud of them.
Give a quick
Go ahead.
synopsis of them. Yeah, tell me. Go on, because they're interesting.
Well, Tom, the oldest, is a lawyer, and he's in Chicago. He does totally workman's comp, and in the process has really sort of had to give himself an MD degree, because what he deals with is workers who've been hurt on the job, and that's what he does. When he first went to Chicago, he joined a firm that did the same thing, a rather large, well-respected firm. He didn't like the way they were treating their clients, so he has been in sole practice for a long, long time.
This is your oldest.
Extremely busy. He's the oldest, and his wife, Judy, who's just wonderful, goes with him every day and runs his office. He says, I couldn't do it without Judy. And they have 3 kids, twins. Keith, who also is an MIT graduate and got a graduate degree at Berkeley, is an environmentalist. He's a water control engineer for the California EPA. So he lives in Oakland. John is the next one, and he went to, he started out at Antioch, transferred to Oberlin, and then got a graduate degree, a master's in social planning at the social work school at Boston College. And he has worked for, oh my goodness, maybe 30 years for Harvard at the School of Public Health. First he was Dean of Finance and Administration, and then the last 5 or 6 years he's been the grant manager for a large grant that Harvard got to prevent and treat AIDS in Africa. So he's been back and forth to Africa for a number of years. They set up clinics, and the whole idea was to train the people there and pass it on to the locals. That was completed last year, so he's now retired from Harvard.
Was he in touch with any of our presidents? I know our last one was very interested in AIDS in Africa. Bush.
You mean Clinton?
No, Bush.
Bush. I don't think so. I don't think so. But when you ask about presidents, I want to go back a little bit, if I may.
Sure.
Lyndon Johnson was the first president who campaigned using a helicopter.
Oh.
And at that time, Bob, my husband, was president of the American Helicopter Society. And he was sharp on picking up on things for promotion. And he felt, well, the American Helicopter Society should present Lyndon Johnson with a plaque or some kind of an award for doing this. So they got it set up, and he went to the White House, and I have some wonderful pictures of Bob presenting Lyndon Johnson with his plaque.
Did he have any stories to tell about Johnson?
I certainly don't want to leave out our younger son, Dave, who unfortunately died at a very early age. He was a Yalie, and he went and got his PhD at Case Western Reserve in clinical psychology, and then a postdoc at USC. And he worked as a psychologist at a place in California which dealt with youth that come through the courts, and was apparently very respected and loved, and he unfortunately died 5 days before his wedding of a cerebral aneurysm, and this was quite a blow to our family.
How are you doing with that?
Well, it's been quite a while now, but you never really get over it.
I kind of want to end on a happier note.
That's fine, that's fine. I just didn't want to leave Dave out.
I wouldn't want to leave that out. I wouldn't want to leave that out either. You've been such a plus to our community, and thank you so much. This was a good interview.
Well, I
feel
love
like I know
Dallas.
you.
There's wonderful people here. I have marvelous friends, and it's really my home now.
Yeah.